A red-coated office worker stopped cold on a snowy Chicago sidewalk that night. She was already late, already one mistake away from losing the job that kept her whole life afloat. Yet fate placed a wounded stranger in her path, bleeding, shaking, begging for help no one else would give. Around her, crowds hurried past, pretending not to see. But she knelt anyway, her bright red sleeves soaking in the snow as she pressed her hands to his wound, unaware the choice she made in that moment would cost her everything she had built. In the blink of an eye, Grace Miller went from invisible office worker to the woman who saved the wrong stranger on the wrong night. And she had no idea the man she was fighting to keep alive was the hidden heir to a billionaire empire, one about to turn her entire world upside down. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Chicago in winter had a way of swallowing sound, softening traffic into muffled echoes beneath the heavy quilt of snowfall. The city lights flickered against the icy wind like exhausted sentinels, and the tall buildings, cold slabs of steel and glass, seemed to lean inward, narrowing the streets into frozen corridors. Pedestrians moved through the slush with their shoulders hunched, scarves pulled tight, eyes down, each person fighting their own silent battle against the wind. Among them, Grace Miller stood out like a spark in a dying fire. At 26, she was a striking young woman with warm hazel eyes, soft features, and long chestnut hair usually tied back neatly for work. Her skin was pale from long hours in a windowless office, but her presence was brightened, almost defiant, by her signature red coat. It was an old wool coat, slightly faded at the seams, but it carried a kind of gentle dignity, much like Grace herself. She worked as an administrative assistant at a small insurance firm near the Loop, a job that demanded patience and thanked her with low pay and constant pressure. Grace lived frugally, skipped outings, brought lunch from home, and sent money every month to her mother in Arizona, a woman battling chronic illness, but still insisting she was fine. Grace believed in effort above all else. "If I work hard enough," she always whispered to her reflection, "life has to get better." That afternoon, she was rushing down Wacker Drive through a mix of sleet and snow, clutching a folder of presentation notes. Her heels tapped against the icy pavement as she hurried toward a promotion meeting she had spent 2 weeks preparing for. Her breath puffed like steam in the bitter air. She couldn't afford to be late. Not today, not with rent rising and her mother's latest medical bill still unpaid. But then she saw him. At first, she thought a pile of trash bags had spilled onto the sidewalk, but as she stepped closer, Grace froze. A young man lay half-curled near the edge of the street, his back pressed against a lamppost. Snow clung to his torn charcoal coat, and a dark stain, too thick, too red, blossomed across the fabric. One of his gloves was missing, revealing pale fingers trembling against the ice. He looked about her age, maybe a little older, with a sharply cut jawline partly hidden beneath bruises. His thick, dark hair was matted with blood near the temple, and his cracked lips barely moved with his shallow breaths. People streamed past him without slowing. A businessman in a navy coat stepped around the body like he was dodging a puddle. A woman pushing a stroller glanced, frowned, then kept walking. No one stopped. No one even hesitated. Grace felt her stomach drop. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she knelt, the wool of her red coat soaking instantly through. "Hey, can you hear me?" she whispered. His eyelids fluttered. For a second, she saw the dull gray of his eyes, clouded with fear and fading awareness. "Please," his voice cracked. "Don't." Call the police." Grace stiffened. The words were desperate, but confused. "You're hurt," she said firmly. "You need help." Her hands shook as she pulled off her red scarf and folded it, pressing it gently to the wound at his side. Her breath turned uneven. She had never done real first aid, only watched online clips, read articles, tried to memorize the basics. But now her body moved with an instinct she didn't know she had. She dialed 911 with numb fingers. "Ambulance," she said, voice breaking as wind whipped her hair across her face. "He's bleeding, please hurry." The man reached weakly toward her wrist, as if trying to stop her, but his arm fell. His strength was slipping fast. "Stay with me," she urged. "I'm not leaving you." When the ambulance arrived, paramedics, a woman named Rosa with tired eyes and a tall man with a bushy ginger beard named Mark, moved quickly. Rosa gave Grace a quick, assessing glance. She recognized the way Grace tried to hide her trembling. "You did good," Rosa murmured. "You probably saved him." Grace swallowed hard. "Can I ride with you?" Rosa nodded. "If he's comfortable with it." The gray-eyed man gave the faintest nod before passing out. On instinct, Grace climbed into the ambulance, her red coat streaked with blood. As the doors slammed shut, she exhaled a shaky breath. The siren wailed, echoing between buildings as they sped toward Chicago Mercy Hospital. She didn't know the young man, didn't know if he was a victim, a criminal, or simply unlucky. But she knew one thing. She couldn't have left him there. And by the time they reached the ER, Grace's promotion meeting had already started without her. After the doctors took him inside, she stepped into the hospital hallway, brushing melting snow from her sleeves. Her phone buzzed. Once, twice, then endlessly. Emails, messages, a voicemail from her supervisor. She opened one, then another. Her vision blurred as she read accusation after accusation. Unprofessional conduct. Abandoning responsibilities. Client lost. Disciplinary termination, effective Monday. The last message was cold as ice. Your employment will be terminated. Report to HR for closure. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. Her coat was stained. Her hands were shaking. And for the first time since kneeling in the snow, Grace wondered whether she had saved a life or destroyed her own. The snow in Chicago didn't soften in the days that followed. It hardened, turning into sharp crystals that stung the skin when the wind changed direction. Grace Miller walked through it with her red coat pulled tight around her shoulders, papers flapping in her trembling hands as she stood in the HR office for the last time. The room was painted a dull beige, the color of bureaucratic indifference, and the woman who handled her termination, Marcy Dalton, barely looked old enough for the job. Marcy was petite, with straw blonde hair cut bluntly at her chin, immaculate eyeliner, and a nervous habit of clicking her pen every few seconds. Her voice, though polite, carried the hollow detachment of someone instructed to never show sympathy. She slid the termination papers forward. "Grace, company protocol required you to remain available during client presentations. Your absence contributed to losing that account." "Someone was dying on the street," Grace replied softly. "I couldn't just—" "I understand," Marcy interrupted, though her expression said she did not. "But we must document the incident as a voluntary violation of duty." She tapped the signature line with her pen. "Sign here to receive your final check." Grace hesitated, but the weight of her unpaid bills pushed her hand forward. She signed. Marcy, as if relieved the moment was over, offered an awkward half-smile. "Good luck out there." Grace left without responding. Her apartment felt smaller than ever when she returned. A third-floor walk-up in an aging brick building, the place had thin walls and a heater that clanked like a broken percussion instrument. The hallway light flickered every few minutes, making the whole building feel like it was inhaling and exhaling with exhaustion. Inside, envelopes waited on her kitchen counter. Late notices, medical bills, rent reminders. She tossed her bag aside and sat down at the rickety dining table. She opened her laptop, still wearing her worn red sweater, and sent out a dozen job applications in one desperate burst. Administrative assistant, customer service representative, data entry, receptionist. The world felt huge until you were unemployed. Then suddenly, it shrank to a few dozen positions that hundreds of others were fighting for. Within hours, the replies came in, short, automated rejections. Thank you for your interest, but we have moved forward with another candidate. It was like watching doors slam themselves shut. Trying to distract herself, Grace decided to check on the man she had saved. She returned to the hospital, pushing through the sliding doors into the antiseptic brightness of the ER lobby. At the reception desk sat Nurse Heather Rice, a tall woman with dark freckles across her nose, sharp cheekbones, and a posture that suggested years of back strain. She had a warm voice, the sort that could soften even the harshest news. When Grace asked about Ethan Gray, Heather's face gentled further. Sweetheart, he checked out yesterday, signed himself out, didn't leave any contact info. Did he leave anything at all? Grace pressed. A phone number? An address? Nothing, Heather said, shaking her head. He seemed scared and determined. That's all I can tell you. Grace nodded, thanked her, and walked outside into the biting air. She searched online for Ethan Gray Chicago, but the name was too common, or too false. He had vanished with the same swiftness he had appeared, leaving behind only a blood-stained memory and a hollow ache in her chest she couldn't explain. That night, the wind howled through the gaps in her windows. Grace warmed instant ramen on the stove while her mother's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Linda Miller, a woman in her late 50s with a gentle soul and prematurely graying hair, had a naturally comforting tone, though illness had made her sound breathless lately. Are you eating properly, honey? You sound tired. Grace swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. Just a long week, Mom. I'm fine. She hid the truth. There was no point in adding weight to shoulders already burdened by hospital visits and medication costs. After hanging up, she stood for a long moment in the tiny kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum unevenly. The loneliness felt different tonight. Not just empty, but sharp, like something pressing inward from all sides. She turned off the lights and walked toward her bedroom, the hallway dim and cold. That was when the phone rang. Not her cell phone, the dusty landline on the kitchen wall, the one that rarely rang except for telemarketers or wrong numbers. The sound echoed strangely in the small apartment. Heart pounding, she picked up. Hello? A man's voice answered, deep, smooth, and unfailingly polite, like someone trained to sound important without trying. Good evening. May I speak with Miss Grace Miller? Grace's fingers tightened around the handset. This is her. Miss Miller, the voice continued, a corporate entity would like to discuss a professional opportunity with you. The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning at Walker Tower, top floor. Her breath caught. Walker Tower was one of the tallest, most prestigious buildings in the city, home to firms far beyond anything she had ever interacted with. I didn't apply for any position there. You were recommended, the man replied. They require only that you arrive. 9 o'clock sharp. But who recommended me? I'm afraid I cannot disclose that. Just be sure to bring yourself. That will be enough. The call ended before she could ask anything more. Grace stood frozen, the silence in her apartment suddenly heavier. She crossed to the window, pulled back the thin curtain, and stared out at the city. Far in the distance, Walker Tower glowed like a glass monolith cutting through the south. Dark, beautiful, intimidating, utterly out of reach. She clutched her red coat to her chest as if it were armor. Hope flickered. Fear flickered too. Somewhere between them, she whispered, "What is happening to my life?" And with Walker Tower shining back at her like an omen, Grace suspected tomorrow would change everything. The morning sky over Chicago hung low and heavy, the kind of pale winter gray that swallowed sunlight before it touched the ground. Grace Miller stepped out of the train station into a swirl of fine snow, her red dress hidden beneath a long crimson coat that hugged her frame against the cold. She walked with brisk, uncertain steps toward Walker Tower, a sleek, enormous slab of mirrored steel rising like a blade into the frozen sky. The closer she came, the smaller she felt. Yet something in her straightened spine suggested she would not allow the building to swallow her whole. Inside the revolving doors, she was greeted not by a receptionist, but by Security Officer Daniel Rourke, a tall man in his late 30s with broad shoulders, short dark hair, and a trimmed beard giving him a rugged but controlled appearance. His eyes, a sharp blue, held the cool focus of someone who had spent years in military service before trading fatigues for tailored suits. A faint scar across his jaw hinted at past violence, and his rigid posture whispered discipline etched into his bones. "Miss Grace Miller?" His voice was steady, professional. When she nodded, he gestured respectfully. "This way, please. You're expected upstairs." No clipboard, no ID check. Just certainty. That unsettled her more than anything. He escorted her to a private elevator with silver doors that reflected her anxious expression. As the elevator ascended, smoothly, soundlessly, Grace smoothed the front of her red dress, trying to calm her breathing. The numbers climbed past floors she never knew existed. By the time the display blinked PH, her palms were sweating. The doors opened onto a vast executive lobby with floor-to-ceiling windows that laid Chicago out like a frozen map. The air here was warmer, scented faintly of cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. A glass-walled conference room stood at the center like a throne room. Inside, sitting alone at the massive table, was a man with silver-streaked hair and a suit cut so precisely it could have been sculpted. Richard Walker, the billionaire, the architect of half the skyline. His presence filled the room the way a storm fills the horizon, quiet but dangerous. He had the kind of face that aged like granite, chiseled, stern, and unreadable, with steel-gray eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. Grace felt those eyes weigh her the moment she stepped inside. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. Instead, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." Her pulse raced, but she sat. Richard leaned back slightly, fingers tapping the polished table in a controlled rhythm. "Miss Miller," he began, the words smooth but cold. "Tell me why you abandoned your job obligations to assist a homeless man on the street." Grace blinked. He was bleeding. He needed help." "So you chose to sacrifice your career?" His brows lifted a fraction. "For a stranger?" "It wasn't about choice. Grace forced calm into her voice. I couldn't just step over him like trash. He was dying. Richard's gaze sharpened, the softness of curiosity replaced by the precision of interrogation. Do you often risk everything for people you don't know? I don't calculate kindness, she replied quietly. Richard exhaled, almost a laugh, but not quite. Noble. Impractical. He folded his hands. Walker Enterprises compensates loyalty, competence, practicality, not recklessness. Yet here you sit. Grace met his stare. You asked me to come. Because, Richard said, I like to know the motives of people who become entangled with my family's affairs. A chill slid down her spine. Your family? He didn't elaborate. He simply reached into a folder and slid a document forward. We can offer you a position far superior to your previous employment. High salary, benefits, stability. Consider it compensation for your inconvenience. Grace didn't touch the paper. Mr. Walker, is this supposed to make me feel grateful? No, he replied. It is supposed to be fair. It feels like you're buying me. Richard's eyes hardened. Everything has a price, Miss Miller. Grace stood abruptly, the hem of her red dress catching the light as she turned. Not everything, she said. Not what I did. She backed toward the door. If this meeting was meant to measure my worth by numbers, you've wasted both our time. She left before he could respond. The elevator ride down was louder in her memory than in sound. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. Her breaths fogged the polished doors. She stepped outside into the frigid air, the snow swirling as though the city itself was exhaling. She had barely taken 2 steps down the icy staircase when a sleek black sedan glided to a halt in front of the tower. Its tinted window lowered, and a driver stepped out. A middle-aged man with neat silver hair and posture so upright he could have balanced a tray on his head. His name tag read Jared Linton, and he spoke with a voice calm, low, and respectful, the kind forged from decades of professional service. Miss Miller, someone wishes to see you. But before she could respond, the back door opened. A young man stepped out, tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like second skin, with polished shoes that glinted beneath the streetlight. His dark hair, clean now, neatly styled, framed a familiar face marked by sharp angles and soft shadows. His gray eyes, though, were unmistakable. Ethan, the dying stranger from the sidewalk, reborn as royalty. For a moment, he simply looked at her, nervous but hopeful, his hands lingering awkwardly at his sides, like a man unsure whether to reach out or keep his distance. Grace, he said, voice softer than she remembered. It's me, Ethan. He swallowed. Ethan Walker. Her breath hitched. Hers swooned. Mind reeled. The man she had saved, lost sleep over, been fired for, was the son of the billionaire she had just defied upstairs. The snow fell silently between them. Ethan extended a hand toward her, palm open, exposed, almost pleading. Grace stared at it, at him stunned into stillness on the frozen steps, torn between disbelief and the echo of the night she found him bleeding in the snow. And she did not yet know whether she would take that hand or step away. Chicago woke the next morning with a cruel wind sweeping across the rooftops, turning the fresh snow into sharp spirals of white dust. Grace Miller barely had time to pull on her red coat before her phone erupted with notifications. Dozens, then hundreds, vibrating loud enough to rattle the chipped nightstand. At first, she thought someone had been hurt. But when she unlocked the screen, she froze. Her face was everywhere. A thumbnail on a news site showed her kneeling in the snow, red coat drenched in dark patches, hands pressed against the chest of an unconscious man. Another video, clipped from a street security camera, labeled her the Red Angel of Wacker Drive. A popular talk show displayed an image of her from the hospital hallway, hair messy, cheeks flushed, eyes rimmed with fear. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her. Within minutes, messages poured in, not from friends, but from people who barely remembered her name. Her former supervisor, Graham Porter, a balding man in his mid-40s with a constant sheen of stress-induced sweat on his forehead, texted her in a tone suddenly friendly. "If you'd like to discuss your position again, our door is open. Misunderstandings happen." This from a man who, just days ago, dismissed her with clinical coldness. Graham had always cared more about maintaining his fragile authority than the people under him, and seeing him soften now made Grace's stomach twist. Her neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Agnes McCulley, a thin, elderly woman with wiry gray hair and a permanent frown carved by decades of disappointment, knocked on her door asking for a photo together, dear. It'll help my grandchildren's TikTok. Even her landlord, Mr. Calvin Brooks, a stout man with a pepper-gray beard and money-first attitude, chased her down the stairs to say he could hold off on rent for a bit, speaking in a syrupy tone totally unlike the usual clipped demands slid under her door. Grace felt suffocated. Every knock, message, and artificial smile added weight she didn't know how to carry. By evening, she tried hiding in her small apartment, eating cereal straight from the box while the wind battered the thin balcony railing. Her red coat hung outside, flapping like a torn flag under the winter gusts. The notoriety she never asked for had sunk its claws into her life. A sudden knock startled her. Not the frantic pounding of a reporter, not the impatient tapping of a neighbor. A single, quiet knock. She opened the door. Ethan Walker stood there. No limousine behind him. No security officer. No expensive suit. Just a simple charcoal sweater that hugged his tall frame, dark jeans, and around his neck, a deep red scarf. The same one he had bought earlier that day to replace hers, the one stained on the pavement. Without the polished armor of wealth, he looked almost boyish, though the bruise near his hairline still told the story of violence he'd endured. Up close, Ethan had an unusual mixture of softness and sharpness, a carved jawline softened by gentleness in his gray eyes, an expression both hopeful and apologetic. "Hi," he said quietly. Grace didn't move. She felt the anger rise again, the kind born of fear, exhaustion, and betrayal. "I owe you the truth," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened nervously around the scarf. "I shouldn't have lied. I shouldn't have let you pay the price for helping me. And I shouldn't have let my father put you through that test." A gust of cold air pushed past him, rattling her doorframe. "You think sorry fixes losing my job?" Grace whispered. "My sleep, my sanity. I was drowning, and you could have saved me with one phone call." Ethan swallowed. "I know, and I can't undo what happened. But I came without security, without the name, without anything except what I should have given you from the start. Honesty." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick white envelope, its weight bending slightly in his hand. "This isn't money. It's not charity. It's an opportunity. And if you never want to see me again after this, I'll respect that. Just please read it first. He placed the envelope gently on the kitchen table behind her, like someone laying down a fragile truce, then stepped back into the dim hallway. The wind tugged at his scarf again. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more, maybe explain, maybe ask for forgiveness, but instead, he offered a faint, hopeful smile. "Good night, Grace." She closed the door slowly, her heart pounding too loudly for the silence that followed. When she finally opened the envelope, her hand trembled. Inside was no check, no bribe of any kind, but an official document printed with the emblem of Walker Foundation. The title at the top caught her breath. Offer of Employment. Grace Miller, Community Crisis Project Supervisor. She scanned the details. A full-time position, high salary, robust benefits, a department structured around emergency aid and outreach. And then the line that made her chest tighten. Primary assignment, work directly with Ethan Walker. At the very bottom, in small print, acceptance deadline, 24 hours. Her apartment filled with the ticking of the old wall clock. Outside, the wind howled, pushing against the windows like impatient hands. Grace stared at the contract, feeling the weight of every decision she had made, every choice that led her here. She was out of time, out of excuses, out of certainty. She had one day to choose a future she didn't know whether to fear or embrace. Morning broke over Chicago, not with sunlight, but with a faint silver haze that softened the skyline into ghostly shapes. The city was quiet in that way winter sometimes demanded, cold enough to hush traffic, icy enough to still the sidewalks. Grace Miller stepped outside her apartment with the red dress she had ironed 3 times the night before, her crimson coat cinched tightly around her waist, and a matching red scarf wrapped carefully at her neck. Every thread of red she wore felt like a declaration, not of boldness, but of clarity. She was no longer walking into Walker Tower as someone summoned. She was walking as someone choosing. The tower loomed high above the city, a monolith of glass catching the muted winter light. In its reflection, Grace saw a version of herself she barely recognized, worn down by fear, lifted by courage, reshaped by the storm of the past days. Inside the lobby, Security Officer Daniel Rourke was stationed exactly where he had been yesterday, rigid but respectful. He caught her eye and gave a subtle nod. "Good morning, Miss Miller. They're waiting for you." His voice was steady as ever, but his gaze softened with something like approval. Grace found it strangely comforting. The elevator carried her upward again, but this time her heart didn't feel like it was being squeezed. Her shoulders were straighter. Her breathing was even. When the doors opened onto the penthouse floor, she stepped out with firm confidence, following the warm-toned hallway toward the conference room. Inside, 2 men waited. Richard Walker stood by the window, hands behind his back, his posture carrying the inevitable weight of a man who had shaped cities with his will alone. His steel-gray hair caught faint beams of daylight, and for the first time since she met him, Grace noticed tiredness lining his eyes. Subtle, but real. Ethan stood near the table, dressed simply in a dark sweater and tailored trousers instead of a corporate suit. Without the armor of wealth and power, he looked younger, more human, and the way he watched her when she entered held quiet admiration tinged with nervous hope. "Grace," Richard said, turning toward her. His voice lacked the coldness from their first meeting. It was softer, though still edged with the confidence of a man accustomed to negotiating empires. "Before we proceed, I owe you an apology, a genuine one." Grace remained silent, but attentive. Richard exhaled, a slow breath as if pulling something uncomfortable from his chest. My son grew up surrounded by people who pretended to care for him. People who saw the surname Walker before they saw a boy. I learned to distrust intentions, because every hand extended toward him seemed to ask for something in return. He paused. And I fear I have trained him to expect manipulation as the rule, not the exception. His eyes met hers. But you proved me wrong. Ethan looked down, the corner of his jaw tightening. Grace could tell the confession wasn't easy for either of them. Without speaking, she placed the contract on the table, neatly, purposefully, and slid a separate sheet across its surface. I read the offer, she said. It's generous, but generosity isn't what I need. I need assurance. She tapped the paper. If I join your foundation, it must protect the people who don't have power. I want the program to include emergency safeguards for low-income employees, funds for those who risk themselves doing the right thing, even if it contradicts routine protocol, and an ethical clause. Walker Foundation cannot terminate anyone for saving a life. A moment of silence stretched. Ethan's eyes softened with pride. She's right, he said quietly. This is exactly what the program should stand for. Richard studied Grace for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, a faint smile touched his lips. It was small, but real, the kind that carried years of restraint behind it. You are not simply an employee, Miss Miller, he said. You are precisely the kind of person this foundation needs. He pulled a pen from his inner pocket, signed the revised document with decisive strokes, and slid the pen toward her. And if you'll accept, you will be its conscience, and I hope a steadying force for Ethan. Grace's chest tightened. Slowly, she signed her name, and with that simple movement, it felt as though the world shifted, an old door closing behind her, a new one opening wide. Hours later, after visiting her mother and sharing the news that brought tears to the older woman's eyes, Grace found herself walking along the Chicago River with Ethan. The city lights scattered across the dark water like broken stars. The wind was sharp, biting against her cheeks, but she didn't pull her coat tighter. Instead, she let the cold settle, grounding her. Ethan walked beside her, careful, respectful, as if he was afraid to disturb the moment. Then, quietly, he draped a new red scarf around her shoulders, soft, warm, vibrant. His fingertips lingered for a heartbeat before he pulled back. I kept the old one, he murmured. It's kind of important to me. Grace laughed softly, a sound light as wind chimes. It was torn and covered in blood. Exactly, he said, smiling nervously. It reminds me that someone cared enough to kneel in the snow for me. They reached a small lookout where the river curved beneath a bridge. Ethan took her hand, not with the entitlement of a wealthy heir, but with the uncertainty of a man still learning how to deserve someone's trust. His hand was warm despite the cold. I can't promise I won't mess up, he said softly, but I promise I'll face the storms with you this time. Grace squeezed his hand. We faced them together. Behind them, Walker Tower glowed like a lighthouse. In front of them lay a long road, unknown, unpredictable, but shared. Grace stood with her head lifted, red coat rippling in the winter wind, her hand in the hand of the man who had once been a stranger, bleeding on the pavement. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the doorway to a miracle. Grace never knew that kneeling in the snow for a stranger would open a path that only God Himself could have written. But that's how faith works. Quiet, gentle, and often hidden inside the choices we make when no one is watching. In our everyday lives, we carry bills, fears, responsibilities, and storms that feel too heavy. Yet God places people on our path, moments of courage and unexpected turns, not to break us, but to guide us towards something greater. If you're watching this right now, I pray that God brings peace to your heart, strength to your steps, and light to every dark corner of your journey. May He bless you the way He blessed Grace, through doors she never saw coming. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about where you're watching from or how God has shown up in your life. And don't forget to subscribe so we can walk through more stories of faith, kindness, and quiet miracles together. May God bless you and everyone you love, today, tomorrow, and in every season of your life.